Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 7th paragraph of the 2nd chapter of the 2nd book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Limitation to Material Objects. The text follows. Writers on theory felt the difficulty of the subject soon enough and thought themselves entitled to get rid of it by directing their maxims and systems only upon material things and a one-sided activity. Their aim was to reach results, as in the science for the preparation for war, entirely certain and positive, and therefore only to take into consideration that which could be made of calculation. So another very important reflection on this historical development of the theory of the art of war, right, that von Clausewitz is analyzing conceptually step by step. In this paragraph, the author is fundamentally referring to the intellectual limits that initially were present in this endeavor, right, from the side of a civilization that, as we've seen from the previous paragraphs, had not had even the need previously to a certain point to formulate such a theory, right? So this is important because in history we have to consider that objectively our civilization, first of all, is something very recent, that we give for granted certain achievements, right, even at an intellectual level, because maybe today we're banally acquainted to it and we can achieve them ourselves without too many difficulty, but that objectively costed, and at one point were something completely new that nobody had ever, ventured in. And this is very important because it already presents you this artificiality of the rational problems, the rational efforts, right? There is the knowing is something difficult. First of all, it takes a toll, and secondly is most of the times counterintuitive, right? And this happens simply for the fact that the way our brain developed and our body as well excuse me, was fundamentally was developed in a moment in which human society was relatively simple, right? Which doesn't mean that we're not able to understand what is going on now, let's say in absolute terms. Of course, we can't know everything, and we know much less about today than about today's society and what we did about past societies when we were there, in comparison. And therefore, this triggered over time the necessity to start developing certain intellective functions that are going beyond that, say, natural state. And then that's the reason why, in politics you find, simpletons who like to overwhelmingly like to explain extremely complex and complicated matters just in, a simple narrative, very often a dichotomy, and that there stops. Because that's natural, that's instinctive, that's how a human would essentially develop, even without an education, right? And they do, and these people remain the way they are, even with an education, in part. So that's interesting, because that also highlights the problems that we still have in managing our society, in spite this society is basically coming out of control, right? That we have lost, in great part, control on certain aspects of our world that have to do with its overall, right? Individually we can, of course, say our societies as a whole can control way more things than we used to do in the past, right? Hell, we can even shoot down meteorites if they arrive against the Earth, or something like that, But the problem is that we don't know within our own society what the consequences of certain interactions will be, because the actors, the elements, the energies involved now are much larger than ever before, right? So this in turn will keep producing a lot, as a consequence, a lot of conceptual, theoretical reflections as this. But this was a world that, as we referenced before, is fundamentally in the modern age, or what von Clausewitz is talking about as a period of this transformation, albeit it's really metachronological at this point. Von Clausewitz doesn't mention specifically when did this happen. He obviously knows what he's talking about, but he's making us reflecting on how the problem was in human terms, not in terms of this or that civilization, right? This is particularly important. So it's a historical perspective, but it's not focused on the relative historical context, right? It's contextualized in front of a new need that can emerge into ever, like, for humans in general, right? And in small parts, this is it's not that it was happening at the time and today we don't have to deal with it anymore. It's going on, it's continuing, as we may just said, right? There is always a greater challenge posed by our own world in terms of its own interpretation and the way we can manage it. This is also important in a military historical perspective, because the idea that everything starts from the simplest things, and that's where it basically stops, right? It's a very widespread belief, right? Many military historical approaches in popular culture, I would say, not obviously among the specialists, but sometimes you find prejudices in there too, are based on kind of mechanicistic or teleological or technological prejudices that can cause a big damage, because they're basically focusing on aspects that of which nobody doubts the importance in absolute terms, but that we can't deem as the most important things in relative terms. That is, how do we, is it technology important for today's warfare? Well, yes, but the point is that technology is important because we have, together with technology, an enormous spin-off that is based on our, societies and politics and economics that works together with it, that already entails certain resources that are not strictly technological, but have to do, in fact, with theory, with doctrine, how you're going to use to employ those instruments, and so on. So narrowing it down to, in fact, material objects, as this paragraph to today's von Clausewitz paragraph is doing, is talking about is the real problem, right? So von Clausewitz, first of all, the title, Limitation to Material Objects, right? So framing the concept that there is this innate feeling of saying, let's talk first, which is also logical, right? About things that we do know, or that apparently we think we know about, right? And we think that there is no particular problem. So already starting with this foot basically is a mistake in a certain sense. Excuse me, because if you think that the whole thing begins from just the material problem, you are already narrowing this whole system down, if anything, just even if it's just for starting, right, to this side of the story. That is, what's the relation, for example, instead that with a material object from the side of the person, and what does influence this relation, right? And you understand, for example, that in this sense it's much more important to understand human mind than material objects first, right? Or at least their relation in some way, and all the interaction that happens. So von Clausewitz, however, starts saying writers on theory felt the difficulty of the subject soon enough and thought themselves entitled to get rid of it by directing their maxims and systems only upon material things and a one-sided activity, right? So we have talked about this theorists in the previous paragraphs. We have taken a look at who they were. we have already spotted historically, in historical perspective, that there are limits, right? And we have remembered, in fact, how, and this is very important to understand, the development of civilization rather than also just warfare. The point that theory can emerge only when there is a very sound base, right? That is based fundamentally on that consists fundamentally of practice, of a lot of practice that over time intensifies and brings to the need of controlling it. Theoretically, finding a solution at that point is not simply handling every single element of it, but trying to see if there are higher dynamics that you can spot and control through other means, right? So the theory is largely born by this, is largely born, as we've seen, spontaneously. That is, it's not that people began to write treatises without completely detaching themselves from any practice, etc. Everything did start from the practice. A practice in the sense that remains, effective in depending on the degree of development of a society, right? When theory starts developing, it's because evidently that society starts having more difficulty in keeping track of everything that is going on, right? As we were saying at the beginning, now we are in a very advanced stage of the story. Mass culture has brought us to this, as we often remember. Like 1 century ago, people were much more practically oriented than theoretically oriented, right? Today it's the other way around. So there's been this massive switch for which now we don't really talk much about. Like this is a problem also in the way we think at history, because most of the times history is interpreted through without even posing ourselves the problem of understanding that people reasoned in a different way, not just in terms of morals or values, but actually cognitively speaking. I mean, intellectually, or also intellectually speaking. So that's a big deal, because people were exposed to different problems, right? So even in this passage, we have to be concerned about today, because when we talk about war, remember this is a treaty about war, right? Von Clausewitz is writing his own system relative to these matters. There are certain levels that can be exemplified by the military hierarchy and ranks, etc., where this problem is constantly felt, right? And the same goes throughout civilian society, in all societies. There is a base, a bottom, where you have people largely not caring about all these things. They don't essentially they keep living in their own mostly practically oriented life, for which things go well. There is objectively no need for them to search for much more, right? After all, we have seen that enormous amount of wealth is not what really makes people happier in proportion, right? One thing is, of course, starving, not having a house. That's another thing. But once you get everything more or less right in terms of house, food, electricity, all the bills, and you have a job, you have a car, everything aside from sentimental matters can go well, fairly well. It's a sound base to start from. So as long as that works, most people legitimately say, what, I don't care about anything else. Now that's in perspective a loss of I mean, I say let's say it's legitimate, not because I want to justify this, but we know that factually we can't push for much more than that. I mean, that society has this degree of responsiveness that for which you can start imposing certain things only when, in fact, there is already that spin-off. That is sometimes even just a cultural, theoretical thing that allows them to develop, right? Otherwise, you just pretend to dictate on society what it has to do, and that doesn't work, right? History showed throughout its own that, either you start building basically authoritarian regimes or dictatorships or totalitarian regimes, because, or people will not follow you most of the times if there is no need for it, right? So it's either violence and violation of rights or nothing. So, but there's a problem in part because obviously the choices of the base do condition most of what the rest of the structure is. So when we think of the example of the army, we see constantly how there is an intellective hierarchy that parallels it, for which who is at the top theoretically, hopefully, at least functionally, and if this system really works on the base of competence, is way more intelligent than the person that stays at the base, right? And this is normal. Our human hierarchies are based on competence. We put people in charge of certain things because they know how to sort them out. Then, of course, it's not a perfect system. We make mistakes every day, including appointing people that are incompetent. But generally speaking, our societies do work in a certain fashion, and it's a hell of a miracle that in the first place we even have a civilization going on right now. So if you think about all the odds and all the difficulties that present themselves in the universe that we are here in the first place. So all this for reminding that, and also to back a little bit, back off those, to counter a little bit those anti-intellectualistic attitudes, right? Thinking that just a person who is more intelligent or that is deemed to be more intelligent is just out of option, that you can't, that there's a practical life that those people have gone astray from because just they are corrupt, morally speaking, or they just think about theory and not about practice. There is a problem of this kind, right? I'm always aware of this, and I try, in fact, there is this, there is a side of myself that I don't think I'm a particularly intelligent person, honestly, but I say it sometimes as a positive thinking, because I fall a little bit in this anti-intellectualistic attitude, like saying, there are certain things that matter, and somebody simply doesn't care because it's not much about intelligence, but it's about, being detached from a certain side of reality. I think many people are increasingly detached from reality, but that doesn't come because they're allegedly more intellectual, more intelligent. As a matter of fact, I believe that more intelligent people are actually practically oriented people at the same time, or better, they understand the importance of practice, even they may be inept on their own, like I am, for example, but for practical things, excuse me, but I realized that true intelligence works in the measure in which it's applicable, right? It's something you can apply to make things work for real. Always bearing in mind that this doesn't have to be a positivistic attitude, and that all the challenge and all the difficulty that in the intellect entails is to obtain that more than an intelligence, but a sort of sensitivity, right, for understanding what the sensible, the best choice, or at least the better choice, to put it relatively, is, right? And that's difficult. It's not less difficult than practical problems. On the contrary, right? Because, as we were saying before, society shows us by its segmentation in terms of individual attitudes and behaviors that it's quite not the case. That who is at the top has to make choices that are pretty damn difficult, right? And we're not talking about things like a political iron arms between one thing or another. Things are difficult because you have to make a sacrifice. Did you ask to someone? No. Things are difficult, especially in the way that's kind of a brutal way of dealing with the thing. Things are difficult, first of all, in sorting them out correctly, right? That's important. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So, and that's what von Clausewitz is talking about right here, because he says, writers on theory felt the difficulty of the subject soon enough, right? Because this is immediate, right? We just try that. I mean, it happened to you, probably, many times. I don't know, that you were in school. Let's make an example, plain example. That you heard the teacher's lesson, maybe because you were bored, you had nothing else to do, and you said, oh, well, I got this, I think I understood what he was talking about. Then you go home, and when you start your homework, you start studying the same thing, you realize that there is a greater complexity than you actually thought. That, when thoughts flowed into your head, they kind of made sense step by step, but, when it takes to learn them all together, problems start. It's not just a matter of memory, it's also a matter of connections and making things work precisely. Our brain is lazy. Von Clausewitz has already highlighted it, that humans tendentially prefer to delay the effort, to instinctively, stay away from the most difficult solutions, independently from their, let's say, effectiveness. So this is a big deal, because it means that definitely we're in part we are doomed. Like, there is, and that's part of the reason why, in fact, the majority of society, as we were telling before, stops to relatively simple things, right? It's an economical principle, but it doesn't take into consideration a further economical principle, that is, that you get smarter, you can learn, you can be aware of things that you neither knew that existed. So what it seemed to you before like something, satisfactory, you could start seeing as maybe not enough, because you could more or less easily achieve something else if you put enough effort into it. So this is a problem of self-development that is actually quite important. Many people stop to their 20s in terms of their, intelligence. You can get wiser. Always remember that, intelligence and wisdom are two very, very difficult things in psychology. We know it, actually. It is quite of a problem. But intelligence is more like a tool that you can use to a very ingenious side of the story. It's even devilish, if you want. This is what even, I don't know, the Bible tells beautifully as an anthropological metaphor. The fact that knowledge is dangerous in many ways. It is. It couldn't be otherwise, right? But it's still the best. It's the potentially best thing we can make use of, right, in order to improve our condition, right? So it's quite of a big deal. And the problem with, in fact, there is this element of, you understand how, in this sense, progress and laziness and economy are all deeply intertwined, right? And it takes a lot. It takes not just intelligence, as von Clausewitz says, it takes also a lot of courage to make certain choices. You have to have the guts to sacrifice something, essentially, about yourself. It can be anything, in order to achieve something that, however, can be better. And the problem is that most of the times you start this, you don't even know whether it's going to be worth it. It's our problem, right? Our big problem. And von Clausewitz has this kind of moral, but I don't know how to say that in English, but this gives this moral lesson that by showing to us how war is objectively the most complicated, dangerous, and terrible thing that humans can ever do, well, you can't think of all, and that is based on this idea of, you can make through it through intelligence, courage, determination, etc. Well, it makes you appear all the rest of life as something dramatically easier, for which you can well do that effort that most people wouldn't do just to just for remaining sitting on the couch, eating, I don't know, I don't know what, and typing on their own smartphones. So that's the point. That's where the emptiness also kicks in sometimes. That once you're satisfied just for your most elementary needs, you simply say, well, okay, I don't need to do anything else. That's something for which society loses, right? Including yourself. And there are many implications and consequences attached to this that maybe now we do not discuss, but it's still important, right? Clausewitz here in this phrase makes us understand how immediate the effort for a rational endeavor it really is. It immediately starts. If you haven't thought that thing before, you have to necessarily make an effort. Think about when you're writing something out of scratch. And many people have this blank paper crisis, right? It's tough, when you have to start to write something relatively big and you don't know where to start, because the real problem is to put your thoughts together, because your thoughts are floating around and you know what they are about, but essentially you have never tried most of the times to put them together, and that takes a lot. It takes a lot of energies, of time, of reflection, etc. And yet it's worth it, because when you're able to make a synthesis of it, everything seems much clearer than before, and objectively that achievement helps you to think through more complex things and putting more thoughts together, and that's how intelligence is built. Intelligence is largely artificially built, right? Humans are not meant to be more than than enough intelligent, right? As we were saying before, this is in a biological or evolutionary perspective a kind of a twist that we impose on ourselves through mandatory education and everything, because otherwise we wouldn't need that in the world in which we have been created, right? But society is so complex and pressuring and messed up that we do need to be that intelligence to make it true, right? So Von Clausewitz goes on and says that these writers on theory thought themselves entitled to get rid of it by directing their maxims and systems only upon material things and a one-sided activity. So this is essentially the history of a failure, right? Always remember what what we said also in previous videos about the importance of failures in progress, right? Our society, the achievements of our society are largely not the achievements of success, but they're largely the achievements of failure. There couldn't be a civilization if there hadn't been failure, right? We would be living in the golden age, right, with honey pouring from trees and stuff like that. We wouldn't be doing anything, right? Instead, we live in a world that puts us under constant pressure in an extremely painful and dramatic and tragic and violent way, and that is what pushes us to do something about it, right? So at this point, what von Clausewitz is doing is stinging a little bit by saying, that making this theorists objectively appear like, incompetence in a certain sense, because they give up here. They say they get rid of this difficulty by directing their maxims and systems only upon material things and on one-sided activity, right? So that was easier. They said, okay, well, the world thing is way more complicated than it is, because objectively describing war here is beyond our reach. And here we can be a bit more apologetic for them. Not that von Clausewitz is wrong, because it's important for us to not to do the same. Remember always that Vom Kriege is, always owns this underlying subtle criticism towards certain positivistic approaches that objectively start from, in fact, not from success but from failure. Reflect on this. Have you ever thought about it? The idea of positivism as such. Is it? It's something that comes when you have things easier, right? Which is sort of success, but at the same time is paving the road for further problems, because the more things get complex, even to an achievement, and the more you fundamentally have to deal with them. It's like when you have a success at one point in your life, and you say, now I can't relax, and then you get into some problem because that it doesn't end there, because it basically never ends, and after you say, okay, but I want to take a rest now, I want to enjoy this achievement, and you start thinking, maybe honestly, because you don't realize what the problem is yet, is that I'm so accomplished, I made this, I'm so cool, I'm so great, and then time passes and things start going worse and out of your control, and then you feel the need to catch up with because you realize that you have lost an enormous amount of time where things were speeding much faster than you had previously thought, simply because you were not used to the accomplishments that you had done. And this can be summed up very easily in what happened, I don't know, between with the 19th century and the 20th century, right? 19th century, the myth of progress, of infinite progress, the idea, now it's done, we've found the technology to do everything, second industrial revolution, all this stuff, electricity, all the various, and wait, because this had already happened, there had already been such a previous, let's say, disappointment, but that's more massive, because as we know, that gets infringed, it get stranded violently on the bath of blood of World War I, on the more than 30 years of continuous warfare between the two, with the First and the Second World War, and in which that world that had been sure that everything would go fine had been completely, put upside down, destroyed, had bled like crazy. It was a massive catastrophe, an enormous trauma, right? That in turn sparked something better, because out of not all, obviously positivism existed mostly in certain areas of the world, but it's not that the others were particularly more productive in terms, morally speaking, but the concept is that all of that had happened because you thought essentially you were better or more capable or more intelligent than you actually were. So you have tragedies like the World Wars, the Holocaust, all the hundreds of millions of people killed in the most horrifying ways. And well, that's the product of that mass society that had positivistically spread, increased and expanded in the 19th century, thinking that we had to, that it was done, right? And in part, we are doing it still now. It's like a few days ago, as it was 30 years of the fall of Berlin's Wall. Well, it's not that we behaved in a completely different way. Of course, it's in terms of scale, it's quite of a different thing. But we paid essentially from the early 2000s this false, this illegitimate feeling of security that we said, oh well, the Soviet Union is done for, so we have no enemies whatsoever. Everything's gonna be fine. We're gonna finally have a united world where everyone is fine, happy. Look at ourselves now, right? So that's in many ways what von Clausewitz, we can't say had foreseen in this, strictly speaking, but that knew, that had warned us about, right? These things happen all the time. We're getting given up, And it's like this I don't know, this theorists that feel entitled to say, okay, well, let's stop the material things because we don't have to concern it much. It's like those political strategic analysts that said, oh, well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, everything is going to be fine, right? So it's a problem. It's a problem because we do it continuously. It's one of those natural behaviors. It's not really a historical cycle. It's not really history repeating itself. It's simply humans being always the machines that they are, right? We do work in this way. We're programmed genetically to work that way. It's not a big cultural problem. Of course, there are everything is cultural at the end of the day. There are, of course, cultures that make more mistakes than others, but that's the universal trend of human beings to underestimate threats and problems, or maybe actually problems are overly. There is also in here an attitude that people tend to fear also the next threats at one point that they don't run into them, but sometimes it's better to solve problems directly rather than waiting if you know that there are, right? But men tend to fear more what they don't know than what they actually know, and that's also a great problem. That people are getting lost, in fact, into problems that objectively do not exist, right? Everything seems a big deal. Every news is shouted. Every feeling is exacerbated. Everything is nobody listens to understand. Everybody seems concerned to feel, but not to understand. That's quite of a problem, Of course, you can make an opposite criticism. Think about Chaplin. In The Great Dictator. When he says, we think too much, we feel too little. Well, yeah, that is important, but objectively, humans are not really like that. That is exchanging human for machines. That it was in what that that movie, of course, wanted to represent. Of course, criticizing, fascism and this idea of the individualization, etc. But humans at large, until in fact you don't impose them a dictatorial or totalitarian state, well, that's objectively what they don't do, right? Humans tend to be more or less the same as they've always been, and we know ourselves well enough not to pretend that we're all good or all evil, and that there's always something in between. Can naturally shift brutally, but that still is framed within certain options that in fact we know are there, right? And that we can't battle over every single day, even in every single thought that we have. So that's where rhetorics is limited to, because it appeals to feelings. It doesn't appeal to reason, which is quite of a different thing. What von Clausewitz says is literally that these writers get rid of the problem by sticking simply to maxims and creating systems upon kind of material things, essentially, right? So sticking to problems that are very partial, that have to do only with, essentially, here I'm not sure whether von Clausewitz is really meaning that, but it's most about instruments, right? Or at least, but maybe instruments not, because the instrument already entails that it takes some sort of art or ability to employ. Here it's about the material things, right? Things that appear to be passive. I believe this might be the right interpretation of this paragraph. The idea that there are elements that always stay there, and that you come to exercise something, certain force on, and that they're gonna move accordingly. Already, this excuse me, this is not quite like these material aspects can be also about the enemy, strictly speaking. How many men, how many weapons, or resources, or supplies, stuff like that. Um, so von Clausewitz here is warning against a historical materialism and stressing the importance, but not because of he is an idealist and for anti-materialists or vice versa. It's because that's what humans tendentially feel the need to do, right? They feel the need to stick to the structure, to the matter. That's something we do. For example, when we talk about history, it's easier to think that after all things go in a certain way because there is a structure that functions in that way, and it's largely it has to be. So it kind of relieves you from responsibility. It doesn't stress the fact that there is someone who decides certain things that have tremendous impact on history. And this is typical also of youngsters. Like I think I'm still very influenced by some form of material approach to history, like saying, especially when you have to explain the big things, at the manualistic level, that can be useful, right? If you have to explain certain things on the basis of socio-economical changes, well, that's quite a thing, but it doesn't tell it all, right? And especially when you get into a more advanced survey, you start realizing that even people who didn't remain in history even with a name, etc., did things that were of tremendous importance to change everything. Just think about what single historical figures can do, what the difference with that it made. I don't know, for the world to I don't know, Hitler was about being shot during World War I by a British soldier, and that soldier felt kind of bad for this German guy, and that he didn't, right? And he was even interviewed later. He said, if I had known that he would have become, that what he had become eventually, I would have shot him, right? So even relatively meaningful choices make a hell of a difference in everyday life. So, and that is frightening because it reveals to you like a world that you cannot control, and that's why humans stay away from this thinking largely. That's why they escape the responsibility of thinking a bit more and more widely, because that makes them feel insecure. Right? If you look around you and you start feeling that you can't control most of the things that happen, you start legitimately being concerned. Right? So it's very simple. It's like I only have dark examples in mind, but from my existential fears. But sometimes it's objectively better in a certain by a certain degree to be kind of fatalist of things that can happen. That to accept that there are things you can't control. Because if you had to think about that, we would simply freeze and we would all go extinct, because we wouldn't be able to cope with all the problems, with our mortality, with sufferance, with pain and all. But instead we do, right? So it's interesting to reflect on this, because it always shows you that it's way more complicated than it is, right? So even certain behaviors that we deem as irrational and damaging, at the end of the day, are the salt, the sap for our own for the sake of our own existence in the first place. And that's what is difficult to understand. The things that we get used to do not seem terribly important to us, and that and we tend to underestimate them and to depreciate them even sometimes. And then when we miss them, when we lack them, and we start saying, wow, that was important, but it was too stupid, too ignorant, too young to know it before, right? So this happens all the time, and it's also why we are set on certain different behaviors or attitudes during our ages in life, because that helps us to cope with the unavoidable, right? And it's quite important. So So von Clausewitz here talks about a one-sided activity that these theorists stick to, right? I think referring to the this largely material dimension, right? The idea that it's all about theory devoid, say of objects devoid of the actions. Think about that, because even in military history, this is very often the basic approach that the average person makes. Like, let's suppose everything is on equal ground. Well, war is by definition never on equal ground. So the point is, what are you getting to? I mean, what's your objective, right? That's where von Clausewitz sticks out, because here he is he's the genius in this crowd of simplifiers, right? Instead of concentrating on making things more, picturing things as more complex so that you can be prepared about more things, you simply try to make a synthesis of it, to be more concise. What for? You lose most of it. That's what wargaming, for example, is largely about. In fact, the best war games are the ones who tend to stretch to the limit of imagination, the degree of complexity. But at that point, it becomes even more difficult to manage, right? So it kills the fun. But maybe it's more real. So you see, it's an eternal struggle of our mind, because this really literally gets down to: do you want to make more or less effort with your mind? And the prevalent answer is less effort, and therefore you can get less. You can achieve less. So that's our intrinsic limit. In order to achieve something, you have to make a hell of a struggle, an effort, and you have to lose something, right? And we have mostly a conservative attitude towards our resources, etc. So we can't. We have such limits, partly. So it's a system that that still is based on some sort of maxim as well. So here I'm speculating whether von Clausewitz is thinking even about certain other elements aside from the strictly material things that start emerging as something a bit more I don't know even how to name it that in English. Problematizing, there's something that can be more effective, but it's still largely based at the beginning on this material perspective. So von Clausewitz goes on and says the theory writer's aim was to reach results, as in the science for the preparation for war, entirely certain and positive, and therefore only to take into consideration that which could be made matter of calculation, right? So this extends over time, because essentially it's the same criticism that von Clausewitz makes to his main theoretical rival, Jomini, and his those who followed him. Actually, Jomini was a very intelligent person, and von Clausewitz recognized that. And the same Jomini that initially was von Clausewitz' adversary, when von Clausewitz unfortunately was already dead, said, you know what, he was right, and he was a genius, and he said that so public. So it's important, because that tells you also that there's not only about intelligence, it's also about being a wise, bit loyal, recognizing that certain things are true. So von Clausewitz here is stressing, first of all, the need of reaching a result from this positivistic attitude, which is obvious, right? You want to concentrate on something that works. It's a legitimate concern, right? But if you take out the arguably most important part, just sticking to material things, you well, not arguably, but actually the most important thing, you stick to material aspects of the story, you can't do that. This is probably a way to understand fully Clausewitzian doctrine, theory, that is, if you really are concerned about actual results, there are no shortcuts, right? You have to to study more. You have to expand your intellect into much more than you think. There is no shortcut. There is not the ultimate equation that makes everything working. It never works like that. So if you're really interested in results, you have to reason this way, and not by trying to simplify. Right? That's the key. That's the real point of the story. It's all about that. And the question could be, but how much should we expand this? Well, hopefully infinitely, which is obviously impossible, but it's still better than simplifying. So on an absolute scale, the more things you take into consideration, the better results you're going to achieve. This is obvious. This is how science works. These are truly and purely scientific principles, and it couldn't be otherwise. Always remember that what essentially the main problem of humans is in understanding war is that they're not enough intelligent most of the times. Von Clausewitz said, if we were to imagine a completely abstract war in which everybody knew everything about his forces and the enemy ones and all the possible interactions, there wouldn't be no war, because everybody would be able to sort out the results of every clash. And the reason why war exists is that we are not capable at all of doing this. So which doesn't mean absolutely that war is a mistake, because it's not about doing something that we don't understand. It's doing something. Remember the laws of reciprocity in the first chapter. It's about obtaining something that is based on knocking out your enemy, that is as limited as you are. So there is a positive result that you can achieve. When the Allies destroyed Nazi Germany, well, it's a hell of a result you did achieve, right? It was achieved through, perseverance and intelligence and determination, and everything you need. What von Clausewitz states, though, is that the best result you can achieve is through intelligence, in relative terms, and therefore, if you invest in that, you invest in the best field of all, right? Intelligence can't operate alone. You can't win just by being more intelligent. To make it simple, you can know perfectly how to defeat an enemy, but if you don't have the courage to take a rifle and go out there and kill him, or defend him yourself for that matter, depending on the situation, you will not accomplish anything, right? Let's say this is important because it does pose a problem that you cannot resolve. That is, we are so set on this presumption that we can't solve everything. It's a typical modernistic and positivistic idea that which is the same reason why we have so much difficulty to understand von Clausewitz and to accept it, to embrace him in our culture, in our world, right? Because we do. I mean, like I always remember, all our militaries are essentially based on Clausewitzian doctrine, right? Way or another, and nobody has ever surpassed or basically modified the Clausewitzian doctrine, and there is no way. And the way the times they did, they failed, right? So, sure, you can do whatever you want, but if you really want to achieve a result, you have to stay on this. And it's pretty dramatic that you acknowledge that the only way to obtain a result is to make an enormous effort, right? And that's why it's a deep cultural problem, because if you are born with the myth of eternal progress, for which you can find a little formula in thinking that applying it to reality will solve your problems, well, you don't know how where you come from in the first place. What civilization has been, what you have is worth, really. Where does it come from, and what are our possibilities for the future? And I truly believe this is a deep problem. Like, it's sometimes like even misunderstanding science and taking it as faithfully or fideistically speaking, without any even an actual scientific understanding. So we want to be lied to by people who tell you that there is an easy way, there is a shortcut, there is that everything is easy. Nothing is easy, right? There are better paths, but in the broader path of life, that is not any assurance of how things will turn like, right? Sometimes it's because we do stupid things, sometimes because bad things happen no matter what, right? So if we don't accept this to the core, we cannot accept our own existence. And this is a big deal, right? And tell to someone that you can't, you're limited, you're doomed, that probably will well, I don't want to be too upsetting, but there are so many things that we have been told one day we will do, and very likely we will not do them, or at least we will do them only in the face of some massive change that will entail much else and not necessarily good things, right? I'm sometimes, when I look at history and recent history, I'm relatively, mildly optimistic towards human capability of self-preservation. But over time, I realized that objectively there is no teleological reason for a better future, right? Things can go better as much as they can go worse. Of course, humans try to make them better, but we may arrive at the two things are separated. They travel on parallel tracks, but not necessarily at the same speed or in the same with the same direction at one point. So it's important to in my opinion, be aware of these things, because ultimately von Clausewitz is not lying to you. This is an important thing, that this theory is not promising you anything in terms of a positive approach to reality. He's telling you, if you do certain things, things may go better, tendentially, right? But that not necessarily they will, at all times, right? And still, in order to make them go better, you have to do something for it that costs. So nobody wants to hear this being told, right? And I fear that we will, in fact, at one point outreach our own, let's say, I was reflecting, for example, the fact that probably we will go on Mars pretty soon, right? And I think of the impact that will have, historically speaking. The fact of waking up one day and say, I can't do that. I can't go from a planet to another. Then you look at it in perspective and you say, yeah, but what's so glorious about that? Objectively, that is immensely useful, because we not because we can't think that planet is going to solve our problems. What do you think Mars will objectively represent for the Earth? Like a safe place where to go if the Earth will fail for some reason. It doesn't seem to be a very promising expectation at that point. If anything, such an achievement will be very important for discovering new things in the process that can be reapplied, as new learned lessons on our Earth, and to make things work better. But overall, it's just we as universal dust floating into nothingness, into these rocky planets that, they have some limit that for our tiny existence probably can leave us a lot of time and dreams to live, but what's the point, right? We have to be more realistic and less enthusiastic and less positive, and we don't have to expect too much. After all, we have to work more and expect less, because that's the only way to, maybe not expecting less. You need that sense of things can be improved, but you need to know exactly what improving means and how to achieve that. In order to do it, you have to struggle. So you can't just be a joyful person who stays out there and wanders and dreams, and that's gonna make a difference. That's, if anything, that's gonna only make you the next target for the new advertisements and for turning you into something exploitable from an economical point of view, right? And that's where it stays, right? But the very important topic that is touched in here is that these new theorists are presented by von Clausewitz as someone who essentially had it easier to, at that point, having assessed more or less aware fashion the difficulties of establishing a theory of the art of war. I don't remember how it started, but let's say equating this theory to and its mechanisms to the science for the preparation of war that we have seen, in the first chapter, in the first paragraph of this list. You can go back watching it. That was essentially how armies were, what the theory of war was about. Previously to the development, let's say, of this true theory, practically, was a military theory, but not really a theory of the art of war. So here we are actually talking about the theory of the art of war, right? So this science for the preparation of war was basically, as von Clausewitz says, just to prepare the means that could allow you to fight, rather than studying how to employ them practically, right? So it was a big deal, like in the Middle Ages, in the first place, having someone to send functionally to war, right? Then how wars was fought, the war professionals already did that by themselves. It was mostly about experience. There was no needed of theory, because things were fairly simple to keep theory just like in fact, a useless thing at that point. So here, this already shows you, even in this historical perspective, how modernity, which is what we're talking about at this point in the paragraph, is more, it already tends to achieve more failure in absolute, in relative terms, actually, not in absolute ones, relatively to these efforts. Right, what do these people do? Now, the intellectual potential of modern Europe was higher than the medieval one. It was not a radical difference, but it still was a sensible one. So what do these guys do? They do what every person who starts things without real awareness of the situation does. At the first difficulty, they give up. Right, so they revert to the to applying what they already knew how to do before. So in remaining to a simply, dispositional dimension of, what do I need to use and employ, without actually saying how actually doing it, right? That is, I need this, I need a certain number of artillery, and to cast it, to build it in this way, in this other way, etc. Yeah, but how do you use that? That's where the modern age begins with technologistic prejudices, and that's where it really begins like that. Before it didn't exist. This is the root of technologism, of the idea that essentially by sticking to material things that are things you know how to build, so there's not a big deal explaining how they should be brought to war, makes you think that it stops to that. Like, it's like those questions is like, if I equip my army with this weapon and this other army equips it with this weapon, who does win? This kind of deadliest warriors typical questions, right? That is not a historical question. That has nothing to do with reality. It's not a real problem. Nobody wonders that. Nobody cares about that. It's not what's gonna make the difference at the end of the day. That's not gonna be decisive, at least. It's way more. So von Clausewitz recognizes that the prejudice for technology begins fundamentally at this time, right? And why? Because these military theorists didn't want just practical results. They didn't want to achieve. I mean, they wish they could achieve, of course, practical results. But at the end of the day, from a theoretical point of view, they stopped only to what appeared to be certain and positive. In other words, everything that could be calculated, mathematically speaking, right? Because here it says, and therefore only to take into consideration that which could be made matter of calculation. But this is mind-blowing if you think about it, because it tells you, this is serious, guys, because we live into it every single day. We live into it every single day. We've not lost this. We have, of course, we are aware that such things happen now, because we have a history of science and technology that tells us how this works. It's mostly about an economical, right? It's history of economics chiefly, but it's largely unknown, in my opinion. Or at least, maybe, I don't know, we will wake up tomorrow and see maybe that most of the people have acknowledged this. I don't know, right? But looking around, it doesn't seem to me that there is much of an awareness about this. So just keep your eyes open. And so, this is interesting because you may wonder, but what is actually calculable at this point? What is this certain positive calculations that you can achieve about something? Well, it basically stops to mere theory of disposition. Like, if you study, how far you can shoot with a certain inclination of the barrel, or length of the barrel, type of powder and stuff like that, and bullet and so on and so on. Well, that tells you everything about how a gun works, but it doesn't tell you anything on how you have, or it tells you at least a very few on how you have to use it, and especially in an army, right? Not in a duel that already has its own specificities, by the way. There are different just for practicing, just for shooting a gun, which is cool to do, but it stops there. To hit a target, everything is different depending on what you're doing. So at this point, it's very difficult even to answer what is actually calculable in what is, even in manualistically speaking, of actual utility, right? It's obvious that you can achieve a certain degree of of certainty and positiveness. Physics is not an opinion. Bear in mind that at this point, modern physics was being developed, right? So there was evidently some. That's why before I stressed the relative side of this mistake, because there is an absolute improvement over time. Modern age is growing. Life is getting somewhat better. Things are people are getting more educated. There is a general, the same reason for which this theory starts moving its first steps in the first place, right? But it's still what, based on the potential, makes more mistakes, which is typical of more complex systems, right? More complex system, simpler systems are easier to predict. More difficult, larger systems are more difficult to predict. Therefore, this translated into reality of a society. It means that a society, the more a society is complex, and the more there will be some failure, right? And here, the failure is actually also in absolute terms as well, because of course, it's there is an amount of waste that can be even human life, right? That is massive, and you realize it in modern warfare. That for the armies become larger, and why is there this need for a theory of war? Because obviously, every battle starts becoming more costly, and therefore, the civilization rightfully wants to find out the best way how to employ these instruments in a way that doesn't make you waste so much of the time because of a stupid mistake, incompetence, etc. So this is very interesting because you realize how deep the Clausewitzian thought really is, how revealing about reality it is. And it's not revealing because it tells you what to do, but it shows you what things are. They're already a big deal. Because on that base, you can do what you can know. Let's say you can find out what to do, but if you don't know this first, you're completely out of the of reality by some standard, right? So yeah, this is why I spent all this time with von Clausewitz, because it's really what we need at so many levels in our world right now, and can bring to effective results, right? Alright, so for now, this is, the next time we talk about the superiority of numbers, right? For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.